So did Judith postulate at all that what we call gender dysphoria was normal and not a mental disorder, but a reality that deserved endorsement and confirmation?
I'm not aware of the extent to which she wrote about this. I know she did write about one particular, really the first case study that gave rise to our modern concept of gender as the product of nurture rather than nature. So there were, this is a little bit of history, a departure into history, but there were two twins who were operated on by a paediatrician called Dr. John Money, a endocrinologist. And the story, there's a tragic story actually, the Reimer twins, and they were having surgery on their genitals when they were very small. They were 8 months old. It's often said that it was a botched circumcision, but I think it was some urological issue that was being corrected. Anyway, and the surgical instruments failed and mangled the penis of one of these boys so badly that they were referred to John Money to find out what could be done. And he recommended that because this one particular boy had been so badly damaged, that it would be more kinder to feminize him, to cut off the and to turn him into a girl. And as long as he was affirmed as a girl and never told that he had ever been anything other than a girl, then this was thought to be an entirely satisfactory way of treating this child. And every year, Dr. John Money would check up on the family, and he would write a report that was published very widely in international medical circles about the success of how Brenda was developing beautifully, and Brenda liked to keep her room tidier than her brother, and all of these gender norms were playing out until puberty hit. And then Brenda became suicidal and depressive until eventually her parents decided to tell her the truth. Now, Brenda to re-identify as David Reimer, and it was in adulthood that he and his brother revealed that John Money had done some things which are really very highly questionable to them as children. So he'd obliged them to take their clothes off and to mimic sexual positions with each other.
Oh, no. Oh, my goodness.
And had taken photos of this. And when he was questioned about this later, he said, well, this was so that they could learn the correct sexual behaviours to do with boys and girls. So this is, two twin boys, effectively. Anyway, so they were traumatised by this. Yes. And they both, in adulthood, committed suicide. The brother who had been operated on became schizophrenic, and he killed himself first, and then David did later. But before he did, they went public and they explained everything that John Money had been doing. Now, in the meanwhile, once David decided to identify as a boy, he was not going to have anything more to do with John Money, and so he told his parents that there was no way he was going near John Money anymore. Now, John Money every year had been informing the medical community that his experiment was successful, that actually he had proven through this experiment on unwilling human victims that gender was entirely a matter of nurture and nothing at all to do with nature. And he never corrected that in the international record. So when David said, no, when Brenda stopped wanting to be Brenda, John Money never corrected that and said, look, guys, stop. Sorry, it was all a terrible mistake. So that gave rise to sex change surgeries. In fact, that was John Money was working at Johns Hopkins University Hospital, and this was where all the sex change surgeries started. Yes, and,
I'm familiar with Johns Hopkins. Right. But my goodness, what a travesty of justice that this political agenda has such obvious human wreckage in its wake, where the facts are completely irrelevant to the political agenda and outcomes that are demanded of it, that the victims and patients along the way, reality is completely obfuscated by this redefinition of reality.
Absolutely. It's such a sad story. And I know that Judith Butler did write about that, because the idea that gender as a separate part of biology is something that could be entirely constructed came about. But as far as she's, I'm not aware. I haven't read all of Judith Butler, but I'm only aware of her as the originator of this queer theory. I'm not aware that she would be recommending it as a useful lens to view the world through for high school students.
So
maybe she would, I don't know.
Yeah. How comparable is gender dysphoria to anorexia?
In the 1970s, so Johns Hopkins University Hospital was conducting sex change surgeries pioneered by John Money. And in the 1970s, Paul McHugh was appointed to be the chief psychiatrist of this unit. And he was concerned that there was still a lot of suicides and depression happening to people after they'd had the surgery. So he commissioned an independent study to see whether or not this was an appropriate way to treat gender dysphoria.
Because the theory was in doing this surgery that it was meant to solve and resolve the differences between their perception of being in the wrong body and, well, their perception and their body, and that would somehow improve the mental health and the high suicide rate of these people suffering this dysphoria.
Yes, absolutely. And there is some evidence that it does in the short term, but it's not a long-term solution. And so there are a lot of people coming out of this sort of treatment now who are saying that they were desperate. You know, it sort of led them down a blind alley. It didn't deliver the goods that they wanted. Now, for some people, they do feel that this has been a permanent solution to their problem, and they are 100% happy with it. But then Paul McHugh was concerned that it wasn't solving the problem for enough people. So this independent research survey of the people who had sex change surgery and those that hadn't concluded that the life outcomes for people who had undergone incredibly invasive surgery were at least no better than for those who had resisted it, those who were still living with the mental disorder, the gender dysphoria. And on that basis, he closed the sex change clinic down. 1979. Subsequently, it went private, and now you can get sex changes in all sorts of different ways. It's incredible surgery. It's not a thing to be undertaken lightly at all. Very, very complex and high risk. And I think for those reasons, and also it's irreversible. You know, there is no coming back from this. Yeah. Because it begins with castration for men. And anyway, it's not a thing to be undertaken lightly. So. And Paul McHugh has recently published having worked in this area since the 1970s, and that there were some of Money's colleagues who subsequently left endocrinology and retrained as psychiatrists because they wanted to be able to help people with these conditions, and they realised that was really the help that they needed. They needed psychiatric help, not elaborate sex change surgeries. Yep. And so Paul McHugh has extensive experience. I don't know that there's anyone in the world so well qualified to speak on this subject as he is. And he published an article with Lawrence Mayer at the end of last year, came out in our spring, their autumn, 2016. And it concluded that there is no evidence in science to suggest that gender is a completely separate aspect of your identity, completely separate from biology.
The assumption that science has given us full answers and it is complete is closing off debate about what further science is needed, what the nature of the contemporary science really is.
The science isn't settled.
Science is never settled, okay? That there's always another and better experiment and a better study to do. The claim that it is settled now, that the issues such as born that way or you're fixed or it's immutable, there is no evidence from the science that those things are correct.
So basically he's saying queer theory has no support in science. But he's also was likening this to anorexia, which is the allusion you were making earlier.
Yes. Yeah, I actually had I've got a friend who I hope is still a friend, although she unfriended me on Facebook, which is the official friendship status. And she's got a master's in mental health nursing. And she was horrified that I was comparing gender dysphoria to anorexia. And my point was saying, well, you may be horrified and I may not be as qualified as you, but I can read the reports of people who are at least as qualified as you, if not more. And they're basically saying that you don't treat a mental disorder with disfiguring surgery. It's it should be common sense. It's common sense to me, but maybe I'm not smart enough to understand how this works. But yeah, like you don't give an anorexic liposuction or remove parts of their bodies to help them lose weight. Likewise, it just makes sense to me that you wouldn't chop bits off a person because they feel they're in the wrong body. That seems to me to not be a physical problem, but an emotional, mental problem.
Yes, absolutely. There's another thing called body dysmorphia, where you feel that you ought to be an amputee, and people will go around the country looking for a surgeon to lop off an arm that's perfectly healthy, regarded as very deeply unethical to oblige these wishes because there's a healthy limb. Why would you chop it off?
Yeah, wow.
And Paul McHugh made the same comment about castration. Why would you remove the genitals of these poor men? That's not going to help them. On the other hand, the transgender community feel that to regard it as a mental illness is stigmatizing, and that actually there are biological and chromosomal reasons why they ought to, to explain their condition and their confusion, and that these ought to be given priority over just saying it's a mental illness. But I think all the evidence is that this is evidence of confusion.
I think on that, it's important to note again the fitting metaphor that if my child or dearly loved family member or close friend had anorexia, and they felt that me identifying that as a problem that needed help, professional help, and not something normal or any basis in reality, if they said that that was an insult to them for me to encourage them to get help, they would be wrong. That it would be clearly hateful to patronize them or to placate them and tell them, yeah, you're right, you're absolutely hideously fat and overweight, and you really do need to stop eating, and all the things that the terrible behaviors that anorexics do exhibit. Likewise, if somebody feels that they're in the wrong body, it's got to be the height of compassion and love to actually say, look, I disagree with you. That's not normal, and I want you to get some help because I care about you.
Yes, absolutely. I think that would be our reasoning from compassion, that we would want to help them. And I think there is good reason to suppose that, particularly in children, whenever you discover gender dysphoria in children, it used to be considered a warning for abuse. And that you would go and investigate. Why is it that this child is so unhappy being who they really are? But we're not allowed to recognise that as abuse anymore, or even question it, because if you look at all of this through the lens of queer theory, then the identity in your head, whoever that is, that can't be known or told to you by society. That subjective reality of who you are in your head is who you really are. So there is a certain lack of logic to this, because
look, it's actually abusive in itself. To take a theory like queer theory, which this Johns Hopkins professor, what's his name again?
John Money?
Paul McHugh. So Paul McHugh, this world-renowned expert in biology and transgenderism, for him to say, look, there's absolutely no basis in this gender theory in science, to then use that baseless theory to ignore classic signs of child abuse is in itself abusive.
Yes, no, I think that's definitely a problem. Interestingly enough, the LGBT community have reacted to Paul McHugh's and Lawrence Mayer's article of last year, and they've contacted Johns Hopkins University and asked them to redact or retract this particular article because it doesn't fit with the inclusive agenda. So they're now asking for science, and this is really, I recommend it as reading because it goes through all of the studies into this, and it's a really good sort of literature review, the limits of the studies, what they show, what they don't show, what there might still be room for this hypothesis but not for that one. That's a very well reasoned, argued piece of work, but it doesn't fit with the LGBT agenda, and so the university has been asked to remove it. And I just think that's an extraordinary sign when we begin trying to silence the influence and the information that we're getting from science, because it doesn't fit with a post-structuralist theory that developed from art subjects, social sciences, then I think we are then trying to, how do I say this?
It's definitely dangerous. No, it's definitely dangerous territory. And look, if there's a debate, let's have a debate. If there's conflicting science, let's examine it both. Let's examine both sides and the evidence. There'll be some scientists who will perhaps give credence to one lot while diminishing the other, and there'll be one lot of scientists on this side who interpret the same data differently. But it smacks of political agenda and anti-intellectual dishonesty to completely silence and censor a whole set of data and research that's eminently qualified to be a part of the discussion, and just say, no, that's we don't like it. It's inconvenient. Therefore, you're not even allowed to publish it and offer it any kind of credence whatsoever.
Now, there's another sort of strange twist of logic in all of this, which is that transgender individuals, so there's gender dysphoria, which is where you feel that you're, they've changed the definition of gender dysphoria.
Really?
Recently. So gender dysphoria used to be...
Another definition they've hijacked.
No, it's a very slight change, but it's important. So gender dysphoria used to be the feeling that you were a different gender in your head to what was affirmed by your biology. And that was a mental illness. Now it's only a mental illness if that causes distress. So feeling that you're a man in your head and you've got a woman's body, that's not a problem, only if it causes you distress. And that's what gender dysphoria is now, according to the latest Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So, but it means that...
how abusive. I'm just so sick of these progressive attitudes that fly in the face of reality, to the detriment and injustice of the people that they claim to be helping. Like, again, how ridiculous to tell an anorexic it's not a disorder unless they're suffering distress from it. It's just absurd. It beggars belief.
Yes, no, it does. But within the transgender community, and I think this is something that transgender community and we would all agree on, there is agreement that it's ideal to have your internal gender identity aligning with your external signs of your gender.
Yeah, great.
So we're all agreeing that gender congruity is the ideal. Now, they're just trying to achieve that by another way, by changing their body to match their mind. And there was a very interesting article published recently by somebody who had struggled with this feeling and said, actually, it's much easier just to change your mind.
Wow.
Because you can never change your mitochondrial DNA anyway. And this was partly the reason that Paul McHugh gave up on this idea that sex change surgery was an appropriate treatment for gender dysphoria, because he was saying this is just elaborate plastic surgery and it's cosmetic. You're never, in 1,000 ways, these people are constantly reminded that they're not a real woman. They can never be a proper man again. And so it was really grounded in compassion. That was the reason that he stopped it. So we are just disagreeing on what the compassionate response is, but I think we're all looking for the compassionate response.
Thanks for watching. If you really enjoyed that video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Have a look at this great video next, and check out the website for even more interesting articles and episodes later.